At 0600 hours on April 9, 1940, 10 German destroyers entered Ofotfjord, carrying 2,000 mountain troops toward Narvik, Norway. The operation was the northernmost element of Germany's invasion of Denmark, and Norway launched simultaneously at 515 hours across 1,000 miles of coastline. But Narvik was not militarily significant. The town had 4,000 residents, minimal defenses, no strategic value. The destroyers were risking naval disaster traveling 1,000 miles from German bases to capture a small Arctic port. The objective was not Narvik itself, but what Narvik controlled the railway to Kiruna, Sweden, and access to the iron ore mines that provided 50% of Germany's iron supply. German steel production in 1939 consumed approximately 22 million tons of iron ore annually. Domestic German ore production was approximately 11 million tons. The remaining 11 million tons came from Sweden, primarily from mines at Kiruna and Gällivare in northern Sweden. The Swedish ore was high-grade, containing 60% to 70% iron content compared to 25% to 30% for German domestic ore. German steel mills preferred Swedish ore because higher iron content meant more efficient steel production and better quality steel. The ore traveled from Swedish mines by rail to 2 ports. In summer months, ore was shipped from Luleå on the Swedish coast through the Baltic Sea to German ports. In winter, the Baltic froze, and shipping from Luleå was impossible. Winter shipments used the railway from Kiruna to Narvik, Norway, a port that remained ice-free year-round due to the Gulf Stream. From Narvik, ore ships traveled south along the Norwegian coast to Germany. The coastal route used Norwegian territorial waters, where German ships were protected by Norwegian neutrality from British naval attack. The winter route through Narvik carried approximately 8 million to 10 million tons annually, roughly 40% of Germany's total iron ore imports. From November through April, when Baltic shipping was frozen, the Narvik route was Germany's only access to Swedish ore. If the Narvik route was cut during winter months, German steel production would drop by approximately 40%. The reduction would cripple military production. German rearmament and military operations depended absolutely on uninterrupted Swedish iron ore supply. British naval planners recognized this vulnerability in 1939. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, became obsessed with cutting the iron ore traffic. Churchill calculated that stopping Swedish ore would reduce German steel production more effectively than bombing German factories. Factories could be rebuilt or dispersed, but iron ore supply was geographically fixed. Swedish mines were in Sweden. The ore had to travel through Narvik or Luleå to reach Germany. Interdicting the transportation routes would eliminate German access regardless of what happened to factories. Churchill proposed mining Norwegian territorial waters in December 1939. The operation, codenamed Wilfred, would place mines in Norwegian coastal waters used by German ore ships. The mines would force German ships into international waters where Royal Navy could intercept them. Norway would protest the violation of neutrality, but Churchill considered Norwegian protests acceptable cost. Stopping the iron ore justified violating Norwegian neutrality. The proposal generated intense debate within British government. The Foreign Office opposed violating Norwegian neutrality without Norwegian consent. Norway was friendly neutral that might become allied eventually. Violating Norwegian waters would antagonize Norway, possibly pushing Norway toward Germany. The diplomatic damage might exceed the military benefit. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain supported Foreign Office position: Britain should not violate neutrality of friendly nation. Churchill argued military necessity overrode diplomatic concerns. German war machine depended on Swedish iron ore. Cutting the ore supply would weaken Germany more than any military operation Britain could conduct in 1939-1940. The strategic benefit justified the diplomatic cost. Britain lacked military capability to attack Germany directly, but Britain had naval capability to cut German supply lines. The iron ore route was Germany's most vulnerable supply line. Britain should attack it immediately. The French supported Churchill's position. French military planners calculated that German steel shortage would force Germany to curtail military operations. The shortage might delay or prevent German offensive into France. French Premier Édouard Daladier advocated not just mining Norwegian waters, but landing Allied troops in Norway to occupy Narvik and physically cut the ore route. The occupation would require Norwegian cooperation or would violate Norwegian neutrality militarily, not just symbolically. The Allied debate continued through winter 1939-1940. Churchill pressed for immediate action. Foreign Office advocated caution. French wanted large-scale intervention. Chamberlain hesitated. Meanwhile, German ore ships continued traveling Norwegian coastal waters, carrying millions of tons of ore to German steel mills. Every week of delay allowed Germany to stockpile additional ore. By March 1940, Allied consensus was forming Operation Wilfred would proceed in early April. German intelligence detected Allied planning. German Naval Command received reports that British planned to mine Norwegian waters. The reports came from multiple sources including German agents in Britain, signals intelligence, and diplomatic channels. German planners concluded that British mining operation would likely provoke German response, potentially giving Britain pretext to land troops in Norway. German response was to preempt British action by invading Norway first. The German plan was extraordinary in scope and risk. Operation Weserübung called for simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway on April 9, 1940. 6 divisions would invade Denmark, 6 divisions would invade Norway, landing at Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik simultaneously. The forces would be transported by ship and aircraft. The operation required German Navy to transport troops 1,000 miles from German ports to Narvik, under risk of British naval interception. The operation was most ambitious, amphibious assault of the war to that point. The objective was securing Narvik and the ore route before Britain could cut it. German planners understood that losing access to Swedish ore would be catastrophic for German war economy. German steel production depended on Swedish ore. German military production depended on steel. Therefore, German military operations depended ultimately on Swedish ore. Securing the ore route justified substantial military risk, including potential loss of significant portion of German surface navy. On April 9th, German forces invaded. Denmark was occupied within hours. Danish military resistance was minimal. Norway resisted more effectively but was overwhelmed by German advantages in surprise, air power, and coordination. German forces captured Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, and Trondheim by April 10th. Narvik was captured by April 9th, but German forces at Narvik were isolated. The 10 destroyers that transported troops to Narvik had insufficient fuel for return voyage and remained trapped in Ofotfjord. British naval forces counterattacked at Narvik. First Battle of Narvik on April 10th saw 5 British destroyers attack 10 German destroyers in Ofotfjord. 2 German destroyers were sunk. Second Battle of Narvik on April 13th saw battleship HMS Warspite lead attack that destroyed all remaining German destroyers. The German naval force at Narvik was eliminated, but German troops remained ashore, occupying Narvik and the Ore Railway. Allied forces, British, French, and Polish, landed near Narvik in mid-April with objective of recapturing the town and cutting ore route. The Allied force eventually numbered approximately 25,000 troops, substantially larger than German force of approximately 6,000. Allied forces besieged Narvik through late April and early May. The siege progressed slowly due to Arctic conditions, difficult terrain, and limited Allied naval and air support. On May 28th, Allied forces recaptured Narvik. The ore route was finally cut. German access to Swedish iron ore through Narvik was eliminated. The objective Churchill had advocated for 6 months was achieved. But the victory was brief. German invasion of France on May 10th had created a catastrophic situation in Western Europe. British and French forces were collapsing. Dunkirk evacuation was occurring. The Allied governments decided Norway could not be held while France was falling. Allied forces evacuated Narvik on June 8, 1940. German troops reoccupied the town immediately. The ore route was restored. German ore ships resumed transporting Swedish iron ore through Narvik to Germany. The entire Norwegian campaign, 6 weeks of fighting, thousands of casualties, loss of multiple ships including aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, achieved nothing permanent. By mid-June, Swedish iron ore was flowing to Germany exactly as before the campaign. The Swedish position throughout this was calculated neutrality. Sweden declared neutrality in September 1939 and maintained it throughout the war. Swedish neutrality meant trading with both sides. Sweden sold iron ore to Germany because Germany paid and because Germany was a powerful neighbor that Sweden could not afford to antagonize. Sweden sold ball bearings, machinery, and other goods to Britain because Britain paid in hard currency and gold. Swedish trade with Germany was substantial. In 1940, Germany purchased approximately 10 million tons of Swedish iron ore worth approximately 200 million Reichsmarks. Germany also purchased timber, pulp, ball bearings, and machinery from Sweden. Total Swedish exports to Germany were approximately 40% of Sweden's total exports. The trade was economically significant for Sweden and strategically essential for Germany. Swedish trade with Britain was smaller but valuable. Britain purchased Swedish ball bearings essential for aircraft production and various machinery and goods. Swedish merchant ships transported goods for Britain. Sweden provided intelligence to Britain about German military movements, intelligence that Sweden officially denied providing, but which British intelligence confirmed receiving. Swedish neutrality was not balanced equally. Sweden tilted toward Britain when possible, while maintaining trade with Germany when necessary. The tilt was partly ideological. Swedish government and most Swedish population opposed Nazi ideology and sympathized with democracies, but Sweden was geographically vulnerable. Germany occupied Denmark and Norway by April 1940. German forces were positioned along Swedish borders. Germany could invade Sweden if Sweden took actions that threatened German interests. Swedish iron ore was German vital interest. Sweden understood that cutting off German iron ore access would provoke German invasion. German threats were explicit. In May 1940, German government informed Sweden that any reduction in iron ore exports to Germany would be considered hostile act. German military prepared plans for invading Sweden if necessary, Operation Tannenbaum. The plans were never executed, but their existence was known to Swedish intelligence. Sweden understood that neutrality was conditional on maintaining German iron ore access. Swedish government negotiated carefully. When Germany requested transit rights for German troops traveling through Sweden to Norway, Sweden agreed to limited transit humanitarian supplies and medical personnel could transit. Combat troops could not when Germany requested increased iron ore exports. Sweden negotiated price increases while agreeing to volume increases. Sweden extracted maximum economic benefit while yielding to German pressure where necessary to avoid invasion. The iron ore mines at Kiruna and Gällivare were among the largest in Europe. Kiruna mine produced approximately 16 million tons of ore annually in 1940, roughly two-thirds of Sweden's total iron ore production. Gällivare produced approximately 8 million tons. Total Swedish iron ore production was approximately 24 million tons annually, of which approximately 13 million tons were exported, roughly 10 million to Germany, 2 million to other countries, 1 million through various routes. The ore quality was exceptional. Swedish ore averaged 60% to 70% iron content compared to 30% for German domestic ore, or 45% for French ore from Lorraine. The high iron content meant Swedish ore required less processing and produced better steel. German steel mills using Swedish ore could produce more steel per ton of ore compared to using domestic or French ore. The quality advantage made Swedish ore worth transporting 1,000 miles despite shipping costs and military risks. German domestic ore production was approximately 11 million tons annually, but the ore was low grade. Producing equivalent steel from German domestic ore alone would require processing approximately 40 million tons of ore, roughly 4 times domestic production capacity. German steel mills could not operate on domestic ore alone. Swedish ore was not optional, it was essential. Without Swedish ore, German steel production would collapse to perhaps 50% of requirements. The strategic implications were calculated by German economic planners. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments from 1942, stated post-war that loss of Swedish ore would have reduced German steel production by 40% to 50%. The reduction would have forced cuts in military production proportional to steel shortage. Tank production would drop, aircraft production would drop, artillery production would drop, naval construction would stop. German military would be unable to sustain combat operations at 1943-1944 intensity. British planners understood this and continued advocating attacks on ore supply throughout the war. RAF Bomber Command proposed bombing Swedish mines, proposals rejected by British government because bombing neutral Sweden would be illegal and diplomatically catastrophic. Royal Navy proposed submarine attacks on ore ships in Norwegian waters, proposals implemented sporadically, but limited by submarine availability and Norwegian coastal defenses that Germany established after 1940 invasion. The most effective British action was mining Norwegian coastal waters repeatedly from 1940 through 1944. RAF aircraft and Royal Navy ships laid thousands of mines in Norwegian waters used by ore ships. The mines sank dozens of ore ships and forced ore traffic to use slower, more circuitous routes that reduced tonnage transported. But mining could not stop the traffic. Ore continued flowing to Germany throughout the war at reduced but sufficient volumes. German countermeasures included minesweeping, convoy systems, coastal defenses, and maintaining large garrison in Norway specifically to protect ore route. German forces in Norway numbered approximately 350,000 by 1944, roughly 10% of German army. The forces were not fighting, they were garrisoning Norway primarily to protect ore traffic and prevent Allied invasion. The garrison cost was enormous, but considered justified by value of ore supply. Norwegian resistance attacked ore railways and shipping, but achieved limited effect. Norwegian saboteurs damaged railway lines and bridges repeatedly. The damage was repaired quickly and traffic resumed. Ore transport was too valuable for Germans to allow disruption. Repair crews, security forces, and resources were allocated to maintaining ore flow regardless of cost. Norwegian resistance operations were brave but strategically insufficient to stop the ore traffic. Swedish production expanded during the war. Swedish mines increased output from approximately 12 million tons annually in 1939 to approximately 16 million tons by 1943. The expansion was driven by German demand and high prices. Swedish mining companies profited enormously. Kiruna mine was among the most profitable industrial operations in Europe during the war years. Swedish government taxed mining profits heavily, using revenue to fund Swedish military expansion and social programs. The morality of Swedish neutrality was debated during and after the war. Critics argued Sweden profited from Nazi war machine by selling iron ore that built German weapons that killed Allied soldiers. Swedish ore built Tiger tanks that fought in Russia. Swedish ore built U-boats that sank Allied merchant ships. Swedish ore enabled German war production that prolonged the war. Sweden's neutrality was not morally neutral, it was complicity. Swedish defenders argued that small neutral countries surrounded by German military power had no choice but accommodation. If Sweden had cut ore exports to Germany, Germany would have invaded Sweden and seized the mines. The ore would have reached Germany regardless, but Sweden would have suffered occupation, casualties, and destruction. Swedish neutrality preserved Swedish independence while limiting but not eliminating German access to ore. The alternative was Swedish occupation and unrestricted German access. The debate extended to Swedish trade with Britain. Sweden sold ball bearings to Britain, essential for British aircraft production. Swedish ball bearing exports to Britain were approximately 50% of Britain's ball bearing supply. Without Swedish ball bearings, British aircraft production would have been severely constrained. Swedish neutrality helped Britain as well as Germany. The trade was balanced sufficiently that both sides tolerated it rather than forcing Sweden to choose exclusively. Post-war analysis examined what would have happened if ore route had been cut permanently. Allied planners calculated that cutting Swedish ore supply in 1940 would have reduced German steel production by approximately 40%. The reduction would have forced Germany to curtail military production starting in 1941. German armor and aircraft production would have been reduced. Operation Barbarossa invasion of Soviet Union in June 1941 would have proceeded with reduced forces or might have been delayed. The counterfactual is unprovable but suggestive. If German steel production had been 40% lower, German military production would have been proportionally lower. Wehrmacht would have had fewer tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, trucks. German military operations would have been conducted at reduced scale. Whether this would have changed war's outcome is debatable, but the constraints would have been real and significant. The reason ore route was not cut permanently was a combination of geography, military limitations, and political decisions. Geography favored Germany's Norwegian coast, provided protected water route that was difficult to interdict. Military limitations constrained Britain's Royal Navy could not maintain continuous blockade of Norwegian coast while meeting other commitments. Political decisions prevented more aggressive action. Bombing Swedish mines or invading Sweden was considered illegitimate violation of neutrality. The Swedish economy boomed during the war. Exports increased, profits soared, unemployment disappeared. Swedish GDP grew approximately 20% between 1939 and 1943. The growth was driven by supplying both sides, selling ore and goods to Germany, selling ball bearings and machinery to Britain, maintaining merchant shipping that transported goods for all parties. Swedish neutrality was profitable in ways that belligerent status would not have been. Post-war, Sweden faced criticism for wartime neutrality. The criticism focused on Swedish trade with Nazi Germany and Swedish accommodation of German transit requests. Swedish government defended its wartime policies as necessary for preservation of Swedish independence. The defense was technically correct. Sweden remained independent and unoccupied throughout the war. But moral questions remained about profiting from war while maintaining neutrality. Swedish contribution to Allied cause was more substantial than generally acknowledged. Swedish intelligence provided information to Britain about German military movements. Swedish diplomats assisted Allied intelligence operations. Sweden sheltered refugees from occupied countries. Swedish merchant ships transported goods for Allies despite German submarine threats. Swedish rescue operations saved downed Allied aircrew. The assistance was unofficial and deniable, but real and valuable. The ball-bearing trade illustrated Swedish practical assistance to Allies. SKF, Swedish ball-bearing manufacturer, maintained production for British despite German pressure to reduce exports. British aircraft production depended on Swedish ball bearings. German government demanded Sweden stop ball-bearing exports to Britain. Sweden refused, arguing commercial contracts were sovereign Swedish decisions. Germany protested but did not retaliate militarily because Germany also needed Swedish goods. Swedish resistance to German pressure on ball-bearing exports helped sustain British war production. German dependence on Swedish ore created strategic vulnerability that Germany never solved. German planners recognized the vulnerability but had no alternatives. German domestic ore was insufficient. Ore from occupied territories, France, Poland, Ukraine was inadequate to replace Swedish supply. Germany had to protect Swedish ore access throughout the war. The protection required maintaining large forces in Norway, conducting convoy operations, mining defensive minefields, and accommodating Swedish neutrality even when accommodation was politically costly. The Norwegian campaign of April to June 1940 demonstrated how important Swedish ore was to German strategy. Germany committed substantial naval and military resources to securing Narvik despite operational risks. The German Navy lost 3 cruisers, 10 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels in Norwegian campaign, approximately 20% of German surface fleet. The losses were acceptable because securing ore route justified the cost. No other objective in 1940 warranted such risk to German Navy. British failure to cut ore route permanently was strategic failure with long-term consequences. If ore route had been cut in 1940 and kept cut, German steel shortage would have constrained military production from 1941 onward. The constraints would have affected all German military operations. Whether this would have shortened the war is speculative but possible. At minimum, German military operations would have been conducted at reduced scale. The failure was partly due to competing priorities. In 1940, Britain was fighting for survival. Defending Britain against German invasion took priority over cutting German ore supplies. In 1941 and 1942, Britain was supporting Soviet Union and fighting in North Africa. Resources for Scandinavian operations were limited. By 1943-1944, Allied strategy focused on invading France. Norwegian operations were secondary. The ore route was never top priority long enough to justify resources needed to cut it permanently. The Swedish mines continued operating at high capacity through 1944. German ore imports remained substantial, approximately 8 million to 10 million tons annually through 1944. The imports declined in 1945 as German-controlled territory shrank and transportation networks collapsed. But through most of the war, Swedish ore flowed to Germany consistently, despite Allied efforts to interdict it. The final months of the war illustrated German dependence. By February 1945, Allied bombing had devastated German transportation. Coal could not reach factories. Raw materials could not reach mills. But German authorities maintained ore shipments from Sweden as long as possible. Ore ships traveled from Narvik through increasingly dangerous waters until April 1945. The last ore shipments reached German ports in April 1945, weeks before German surrender. Maintaining ore supply was priority until the end. Post-war, Swedish mining industry continued operating, but at reduced scale. Wartime demand disappeared, prices declined. Production dropped from wartime peak of 16 million tons annually to approximately 10 million tons. But Swedish iron ore remained important export. Kiruna mines continued operating profitably. Modern Kiruna produces approximately 27 million tons annually, more than wartime production serving global steel industry. The historical assessment was that Swedish neutrality benefited Sweden economically while enabling German war production strategically. Sweden maintained independence and prosperity during catastrophic European conflict, but Swedish neutrality helped sustain German military operations by providing essential raw material Germany could not obtain elsewhere. The moral ambiguity was never resolved satisfactorily. Sweden acted in Swedish interests, which was rational national policy but morally questionable in context of total war against Nazi Germany. The Allied failure to cut ore supply was a strategic mistake that prolonged the war. Churchill's early advocacy for cutting ore route was strategically sound. The execution was inadequate. If Allied forces had occupied Narvik permanently in 1940, or if Royal Navy had maintained effective blockade of Norwegian waters, German steel production would have declined significantly. The decline would have constrained German military operations throughout the war. But the failure illustrated fundamental problem in coalition warfare: competing priorities, limited resources, political constraints. Cutting ore supply was strategically valuable, but required resources and political will that were never fully committed. The result was that Swedish iron ore continued flowing to Germany for 6 years, sustaining German steel production and enabling German military operations until final defeat. This was the story of Swedish iron ore, the resource that provided 50% of Germany's iron supply and sustained German steel production throughout World War II. The neutral country that traded with both sides while tilting toward Britain when possible and accommodating Germany when necessary. The Norwegian port of Narvik that Germany invaded to protect and Allies attacked to capture. The ore route that Churchill called more important than any battlefield yet was never cut permanently. The mines at Kiruna that produced 16 million tons annually and made Swedish mining companies immensely profitable. The strategic resource that Germany could not live without and that shaped Scandinavian campaign of 1940. The neutral trade that helped both sides but helped Germany more because Germany depended absolutely on Swedish ore while Britain had alternatives. The geological and geographical accident that placed high-grade iron ore in neutral country adjacent to Germany and made that neutrality strategically decisive for 6 years of total war